Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Brain, and I want to welcome you to this presentation on future-proofing your operations through WMS and Robotics, presented by Exotech and Texas. Quick reminder, there will be an audience question and answer session at the end of this presentation. Audience members are encouraged to submit their questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Now, in the dynamic world of warehouse operations, adapting to rapid changes is crucial. But the array of technical options, technology options, can be overwhelming. So today, we're going to help clear the air and help you make informed decisions by delving into the synergy between two pivotal solutions: warehouse management systems, or WMS, and robotics. You'll come away with a strong understanding of the latest advances in WMS and robotics, best practices for implementing these solutions, and key functionalities that are crucial to making these technologies work in the long run. With that, I want to introduce our speakers for today. John Jackson is a senior sales executive with Exotech. As an account executive, John leads Exotech's expansion into the North American market, driving the adoption of the company's robotic solutions. With over 15 years of experience in material handling, he possesses specialized expertise in guiding large enterprises towards seamless integration of innovative supply chain applications. Guy Courtin is Vice President of Industry and Alliances with Texas, an omnichannel supply chain technology provider. He is a well-respected thought leader and speaker on the topic of the future of supply chains and retail in particular. In his current role, he leads Texas's advanced technology and automation go-to-market strategy. He brings over 20 years of experience in the supply chain industry. Well, let's start off with you, John. Tell us a little bit about the Exotech Skypod system.
Sure. Well, thank you, Bob. I appreciate this. So Exotech is a robotics company whose focus is on warehouse automation. We are an end-to-end systems integrator, but really our bread and butter is going to be with our goods-to-person innovation called the Skypod system, which is used for order fulfillment. The Skypods themselves are AMRs, and they are used to drive a large tote handling system that helps companies to drive productivity rates of their workforce by nearly 5 times.
Thank you. Guy, tell us a little bit about Texas.
Sure. Thanks, Bob, and thanks for having me on this. So for those of you who don't know Texas, we are a software supply chain company, as you mentioned earlier, Bob. As you can see, we've been around for over 40 years and really focusing on 3 key industries: distribution, retail, and healthcare. And within that, we offer a variety of solutions, primarily for this discussion around WMS, but also TMS, order management, point of use, and a whole host of others. So we're really excited about being part of this. And of course, talk about how our solution fits in nicely with things like Exotech and other automation.
Thank you very much, Guy. With that, let's move into the panel discussion portion of our presentation today, and let's frame it at the beginning with kind of a look at the state of the union. I want to ask first John, and then we'll get Guy to chime in as well. Can you provide an overview of how robotics and WMS are currently being utilized in warehouse operations? John?
Yeah, sure. Well, so as far as robotics being used in warehousing today, some are used for truck unloading. There's pallet handling and storage, case handling, but really the specialty that I could speak to better is going to be the goods to person order fulfillment and automated picking. So basically, there's a couple different categories of those. One are the shelf movers, and the other are the tote movers. And of the tote movers, there's really 3 main types within that subcategory. The collaborative digging robots, then there's and so that's the AutoStores and the Ocados of the world, where the robots are working together and they're digging out of a stack of totes to get to the specific SKU tote to be brought out ultimately to the operator. And then there's masted AMRs. So the AMRs actually have a mast that they kind of like a small forklift will grab things off of the shelf, totes primarily, And there's usually a handoff there to a smaller robot that will then ferry that out to an operator that's actually building the orders. And then the space that I'm in is some folks are calling it the mobile ASRS. It's a high-speed system that gets 100% access to any of the SKUs in the system and has a very high reactivity rate, which is the exciting kind of leading edge of robotics right now. And then the older shelf moving style, they're kind of getting into tote handling too, where they're putting it on the shelves and doing a handoff to some sort of a carousel style picking station, or maybe even to another robot. So that's what we're seeing as far as stuff getting deployed out into warehousing on the robotics front these days.
Thank you, John. AMR, Autonomous Mobile Robots, ASRS, Automated Storage and Retrieval System, just to make sure we're on the same page with our acronyms. We're going to be hearing a lot of those today. Okay, Guy, what's your State of the Union overview?
No, absolutely, Bob. And I think, John provided a really good overview, sort of some of the robotics that he's seeing. But maybe I'll take a step back, and the State of the Union that I look at when it comes to the warehouse, in particular within the supply chain, is really driven by a couple of factors. One is the reduction or the difficulty of maintaining employment, right? Having people or labor on the floor of the warehouse doing a whole host of tasks. And John touched upon some of those things that robotics are going to take over, but also some things where robotics are going to work with the labor. So that's one thing. And one of the statistics I saw, which is really interesting, is just at Amazon by itself, they have over a course of a year, close to like 120% turnover across all their warehouse employees. So if even Amazon can't hold on to employees for a full year, what does that say about the rest of the industry? So that's one of the big drivers I see. The second one is really the usage of the warehouse. And what I mean by that is the role the warehouse plays in the supply chain today has changed drastically over the past 10, 15, 20 years, in large part because of what? Because of e-commerce. So warehouses are no longer just a throughput for inventory. They're now doing each is picking, they're doing packing, obviously, but they're also doing kitting. They're taking returns. They might do last mile manufacturing in the warehouse. So that's also adding a huge change, if you will, in the space. So from the State of the Union, when we think about that from the software side, what we're asking the software to do, just like what John mentioned, the robotics, we're asking the software to do a lot of different things that it wasn't potentially built to do, or that it wasn't really thought of when we first started this journey, if you will, 40, 50, 60 years ago, which was, well, we're just going to receive goods, we're going to slot them, we'll do some cycle counting, and then when you need to take them out, we'll just build a pallet and move it out. Now we're asking both the software and the hardware to do a lot of different things. Why? Because we're having a shortage of labor, so we need to have more sophisticated systems. And B, the warehouse itself, the business the warehouse is in, has drastically changed. And I think will continue to evolve as us as consumers, whether B2B or B2C, are going to demand this of our supply chain.
The very definition of what is a warehouse today in terms of size, in terms of location, in terms of what happens inside those four walls, it's changing all the time. So that's a great perspective from both of you, John and Guy. Thanks for setting the stage for us for this discussion. Let's drill down into some discussion about the tools. No pun intended there. But I'm curious if the two of you could address, maybe starting with John again on this one, what is the appropriate time for businesses to implement automation in their warehouse?
Yeah, so there's not a real hard and fast rule. From what I've seen, most companies will start manual, which is totally appropriate. But when they start to hit around the 1 million order lines per year mark, that's when automation starts to make sense. So that would be, around 300 to 400 lines per hour. And you probably have, 8 to 10 pickers in the warehouse doing that, and maybe 2 to 8 replenishment workers, depending on the type of goods you're moving. But when you automate, you can really get that down to between 2 and 5 folks. Or like in most cases for people, you keep all those employees and you use the automation just to be able to grow. Because it's too painful to try and hire and keep workers. So yeah, Around 1 million order lines. So an order line is going to be, if Bob orders a pair of Adidas and a pair of socks, it's two order lines,
Mhm.
which would be two picks. And that's usually when I start to look at, all right, there's a good business case to be had once you're that big, I'd say.
Guy, if I'm a warehouse, I want to know when to put in automation. What's your perspective on that?
I think when to think about automation is right now. I think that's the first part. Let's sort of separate the two, right? I think any warehouse and a lot of warehouses that I visit, and I'm sure John has the same reaction to this, like a lot of warehouses I visit, at the end of the day, I'm like, yeah, you need to think about automation. To your point, though, when do you want to implement and when you want to start really putting, where the rubber meets the road? And I think John has a good point. So think about what kind of automation, what is the function of your warehouse? Like to John's point, like how many lines are you picking? How many orders? How fast is this going out? What's your labor issue? To start thinking about it. And I would say one thing to think about too is what kind of use case you're trying to solve. Because again, if we look at what automation is out there is available to the warehouse professional, the reality is that last I looked, there's something like 650 different automation OEMs out there. Now they're not all doing the same automation; they're doing different types and styles. So whether like what John does around for the ASRS, or whether it's an AMR, or whether it's a point-to-point solution, or what's a picking arm, whether it's just moving dunnage, right? There's all kinds of solutions out there. So I would, for me, it's always, you should think about automation today because it's not the future, it's the today. But when you start rolling it out, that's when you really have to sort of dive in. And to John's point, look at the specifics. Like, does this make sense for me to automate? What kind of automation do I need to look for to solve that specific use case? I would even argue, are there sort of stepstone or steps in automation, meaning are there automation that is a little bit less of a lift, so to speak, that can introduce automation into your warehouse, and then you start rolling it out where maybe you start working on the fringes. So for example, I mentioned dunnage removal. We all know that we have to, in most warehouses, have to remove dunnage. And a lot of times I've heard this before. There's some warehouses, it's 1 or 1.5 FTE. That's all they do. Well, maybe there's a robotic solution that can just remove that dunnage for you. So now you're not touching your core function of your warehouse, but you're starting to address some of the needs of your warehouse, and you sort of ease your warehouse into the automation journey, if you will. And I think that's appropriate to think of as well, because too often, and I used to work at an automation company, we'd say, hey, bring us in, we'll do your each is picking, which sounds great. But there's a whole host of things to think about when you introduce that if you haven't already dipped your toe into it, it might surprise you in a negative way.
Yeah. And it is just so confusing. I mean, you guys are describing this massive world of automation, so many different options to choose from. Let's say, okay, I am a warehouse and I've decided, yeah, I'm going ahead with automation. Great. But I don't know where to start. I don't know what strategic features or functionalities I should be prioritizing when I'm considering an investment in WMS and robotics. Gee, help me out.
Yeah. So I think from that perspective, from my standpoint, I think how we help is if we take a step back, right? I think first is understand, is your warehouse ready for such an investment? What I mean by that is everything from, we're going to talk about the WMS, right? Your software layer, right? Is your platform ready and future-proof, if you will, to add automation? Because at the end of the day, the software and the hardware has to speak together to harmonize what you're trying to do. I think the other part to think about too, Bob, is physically, is your warehouse ready for this, right? Some of the things that you have to take in consideration, and of course, John can talk a lot more about this from their perspective, but all automation at some level, there are some physical constraints or physical rules, if you will, that you need to ensure you follow for you to start thinking about that automation. For example, if I have very narrow aisles, well, maybe I can't fit an AMR in there. Or if I have low ceilings, does that mean I can put in a specific ASRS? But I think it's really to do some housekeeping first, both from your software system, right? What is your system of record? What does your WMS look like? And then what does your physical warehouse look like? And does it make sense to put that automation in based on the use cases you're trying to solve?
Seems like few warehouse operators have the luxury of a greenfield site that can be designed with automation in mind from the very start. More often than not, you're bringing automation into an existing facility, and you got to figure out how you're going to squeeze it all in, right? Yeah. John, what do you think on some strategic features and functionalities, prioritizing those?
Sure. Well, so it goes back to the type of robotic solutions that are out there. And I would say that if you want to be nimble, then go for the 100% access to every SKU. That will help you satisfy those demanding e-commerce orders while using algorithms to bring efficiency on the rest of the lines. I would be on the look for less conveyors. They're less flexible. The more robots you can have doing things at speed, the more redundancy and higher uptime you can manage to achieve. And then when you're actually deploying one of these systems, I encourage customers to go a little bit over on the storage and under on the throughput, because adding the robots later is easier than adding the storage. But the great part about any of these solutions is the flexibility is just leaps and bounds better than traditional automation. And folks can really dial in their capital investment a lot better with those technologies.
Okay, as you guys point out, today's warehouse is having to achieve numerous different numerous functions, both in an omni-channel environment, serving maybe eaches and small picks for online, as well as pallets for retail fulfillment. So I'm just wondering what criteria in an omni-channel operation, how do you prioritize when you're implementing these automation solutions? How do you ensure seamless integration across these channels with your technology? Guy?
Yeah, that's the $10 million question. And to sort of build upon what John said, he mentioned conveyors, which I'm glad he brought up, because that's sort of in a way the antithesis of this, which is the flexibility and the convenience. And I think to your question, Bob, it's when we think about how we bring these technologies in from the hardware side to the software side, I think the big question too is and this is for the listeners, is really push upon, when I say us, right? Us, the software and the hardware providers, to really work through how we create that connectivity, right, between the systems. How do we leverage your WMS? How does that now communicate to whatever automation system you're picking, or potentially the different types of automation systems you're picking, right? John mentioned some interesting stuff where you might see different types of robotics within your warehouse to do different functions. And I think that's going to be what we're going to see evolve. And I think the hard part, and I think the part that we all as an industry are working to do a better job for the users, to ensure that the connective tissue is properly built from the beginning. Because at the end of the day, hardware is just metal and plastic and rubber and all this, and software has to be able to communicate with that hardware to maximize what that hardware is out to do. And at some level too, the software, the WMS, wants to take advantage of it by ingesting some of the data that hardware is now creating, so that the software can do a better job in terms of optimizing what it's doing. So I think for me, that's the big one, right? It's the ability to have this integration, this interoperability, or this communication between the system of record, usually the software, the WMS, and the hardware that's going to be doing the work.
John, integration across channels. What's your insight there?
Yeah, I think Guy is right on. I like what he said there, because if you build out a system that collapses into lesser and lesser efficiency, when you start adding e-commerce, you want to avoid that, right? When you're adding throughput, let's say you go with a robotics solution, when you're adding robots to increase that throughput, do you have a linear growth or a logarithmic one? Because if you have robots on a grid, or robots that are managing traffic on the floor, then you want to make sure that the system is going to run in the same way when you have a different profile of orders that you're trying to fulfill. So yeah, managing the e-com flow as efficiently as you need is going to be the big question on the future horizon. If you're starting with the omni-channel, or you're starting the store and shifting to omni-channel. So the free roaming AMRs will let you kind of unbind from a more linear conveyor approach. And the masted AMRs are going to also have some issues there. But it's, in terms of starting out and flexibility, it's all there. But the higher traffic volumes are going to start to affect things in a logarithmic way. So you're not going to get the same bang for your buck later on unless you pre-plan for that.
Yeah.
So just something to think about.
Funny thing is a reminder that we used to think of conveyors as being automation. So now we look at it and it's so legacy, we don't even think of it in that term anymore. Okay, so we've talked about integrating channels in the warehouse. Let's talk about integrating the actual technology itself. I'm looking for some best practices here for ensuring seamless integration between WMS on one hand and other aspects of warehouse automation, both hardware and software on the other, bringing it all together. There's so many systems, not all going to come from the same vendor, whether you like it or not. John, what do you think about that?
Oh, well, I think I'll probably need to leave the lion's share of this one to Guy. But in my experience, I've seen, of course, deployments that have gone better than others. And I would say testing. Most automation companies will offer a server to do integration testing before go live. So take full advantage of that. And there's no reason you shouldn't start early while even the hardware installation is underway. So testing, I would highly recommend do that and do it early.
Okay. Guy, what do you think? Integrating the actual technology.
Yeah, I think to John's point, testing, but I would even go a step further. John said to start thinking while you're putting the hardware in. I would say start well before that, right? In the buying process of you being the customer, looking at specific automation is work with your WMS provider, right? Whether it's us or someone else. When you start considering automation, why? Because it helps all the parties involved to start preparing, if you will, with regards to what does that integration look like? Because to your point, Bob, at the end of the day, I think the integration, whether it's with WMS or whatever other system, that's a long pole in the tent, right? That's where, on the surface, we all say, well, it should be easy. And all parties seem to nod their head and say, we can do it. And even if you've done it a dozen times with the same hardware provider, each warehouse is going to be unique, right? Each need is going to be unique. Each WMS is going to be unique, have a little bit of a different flavor. And I think that's okay, right? I think that to me is an indication that we're making sure that the software is addressing the specific needs of that warehouse, whether it's in healthcare, distribution, retail, oil and gas, electric distribution, whatever that may be. But the question is, how soon can you start working with your solution providers to understand what that work will entail to make sure that the connectivity works? Because to John's point, right, you have to get to a point where you can start testing. And then secondarily, I think you have to be flexible enough, if you will, so that you will understand that even if you test it and it seems great in a sandbox environment, once you turn it on, be flexible, because there are going to be things, unintended consequences, things that we couldn't think of until the machine started to run. That is really the key part too, is to be constantly flexible, if you will, with that, understand where there might be some bugs or some issues and be ready for that, right? We can't assume that once we turn on the machine and it's go time, that everything is going to be seamless and the communication between the software and the hardware is going to work perfectly and the data is going to go back and forth with no issues. We all know that's not going to be the case. So be flexible, be patient. Absolutely, to John's point, test, right? Be as prepared as you can so when it goes live that you're ready to go. And I would say start the conversation as early as possible with both your software provider and the hardware side to make sure that they themselves are communicating to understand what will it take to ensure that our systems work seamlessly together.
Is the assumption here that the WMS is indeed the overarching single point of control over all these systems? Because as we know, we have WCS, warehouse control systems, we have WES, warehouse execution systems, we have order management systems and other, miscellaneous types of technology and software running around a warehouse. Is the WMS the top of this, at the top of the pyramid?
I would say that if I take the pyramid and sort of flip it upside down, I say that WMS is the foundational piece for all this, meaning what? That it's the system of record that still can contain the SKU location, the SKU count, what is going on, and some of the functionality that you need. But to your point, Bob, you're spot on, is that what we're seeing is that we are getting more specific packages, software packages to control different parts, WES, WCS, et cetera. We haven't even talked about labor management solutions. Of course, that's a little bit outside of robotics, but all these different execution parts that are sort of sub parts of a WMS that are going to play out in the warehouse. So that's the other part too, right? To John's point about testing is to understand, all right, is my WMS going to just communicate with that hardware? What is that going to look like? Or is my WMS or whatever software I'm using, am I looking to control more of the warehouse functionality? Where does the water's edge start between the WMS and the hardware player, right? For example, of course, Exotech and others are going to have their own software layer to control what happens within their system. So where does that water's edge, start and stop? These are all questions that you need to have. I don't want to say full clarity. It would be great to be fully clarified before you go in, but to at least have 80% of it understood as you're proceeding down this road. Because again, unintended consequences, maybe your WMS is supposed to do X, Y, and Z, but you've added some mod 10 years ago that means that the Y or the X, Y, and Z is now being controlled by something else. And oops, I didn't realize that. And now I go into it with an Exotech, and I thought my WMS would tell them this, but that piece of data is sitting out somewhere else, and oh goodness, it broke. So again, it's really, to John's point, test, do it early, understand what are the different systems you're leveraging from a software side, and just be prepared to, again, be flexible.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you indicated earlier, some implementations go better than others. That's just a reality, the way it goes. And beyond the testing, beyond the good preparation that you guys have both advised us to undertake, I'm wondering what are some other common challenges or pitfalls to avoid during the implementation of these technologies? John?
Yeah, I would say that mobilizing your IT resources in time, don't surprise them as much as you can. Working with a good partner like Texas will certainly help with that. But yeah, it seems like they're a little late to the game, it seems, in the planning often, and they never appreciate that, and it tends to delay things. Outside of that, I think you will have another set of good points on the IT side, but yeah, as far as physically putting stuff into the building, you want to watch out for fire suppression. 99% of the systems that store goods at a high density level like this will require fire suppression, usually inside the actual physical rack itself. So get documentation together from your suppliers, get it in front of your insurance company, and local municipalities, especially, just so that there's no surprises there. Floor remediation is common among these technologies. So I think those tend to surprise people a little bit. So you just want to pre-plan for those things.
Key things to avoid during implementation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think John hit a lot of the physical side, and I think those are all good points. I think from the software side, like you said, not every implementation goes great, and we know that. I think first it's preach patience, right? Be patient. I think all sides are always well intended to get things up and running. But I also would say, have honest conversations. What I mean by that is I'll quote my old boss who said this, right? Bad news does not get better with time. It's not like a fine wine. So if there are issues that you're starting to see, bring them up, right? Start working with your partner, whether it's your WMS player or a third-party integrator or your hardware player, and have these conversations, because I think that's what a lot of times, what I've certainly seen in some bad implementations is I don't want to say simple, but there are issues that if we had just talked and had a conversation and brought it up when we thought this would come up, we would have probably gone to a solution a lot faster. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't have been a problem, but the solution would have been found a lot quicker. So I think for me, that's the big ones. And I'm going to keep preaching on this. To me, is start early, right? Start early. And to John's point, like if you can start getting, the quicker you get to the testing phase, start test. Why? Because that's going to put the system, under some hardship to see what happens before you go live with it. And I think sometimes we kind of, I don't say bypass, but we sort of, a lot of the hard work comes up, and then all of a sudden we're like, oh, okay, we're good, let's go. But I really think it's that communication, have patience, get things done early, have the conversation early, and get to that test phase as quickly as you can, because that's going to be, sort of the last stage that you can really run things through their test, if you will, before you obviously turn it live. And then once it goes live, more patience, right? Because I think that's the part that we all realize is just because you flip that switch doesn't mean everything goes according to plan. We all know that. But I think, for me, it's one of those things, Bob, like, some software players and integrators and hardware get bad rap. I think a lot of it is, the customer needs to have patience, be strict, be tough with us, push us, but also have some patience with us. We're trying to do the best we can.
Mm-hmm. Okay, patience is a virtue for sure, but companies are increasingly impatient these days about realizing a return on their investment, because after all, these systems cost money up front. For all the benefits that they promise in the future and the necessity of implementing them, there's still a pressure on capital expenditures. So that being the case, give me some key best practices for evaluating the return on investment for WMS and also for robotics. Guy?
Yeah, I think the first and foremost is the sort of the traditional ROI model. I think we need to revamp it a little bit. What I mean by that is we look at, okay, how much does it cost to invest in the software, and then the cost of implementation, and then what are the results it's going to do. I think those are still good. We need to look at those. And I think you need to work with your solution provider to really hone in on what that looks like. I would say this is give yourself permission. If it's too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true. But one thing that I think we sometimes avoid on the ROI calculation is the following: is what is the opportunity cost? So what I mean by that is, because we see this all the time as a software player, and I'm sure John can see it sometimes too, is, we're going to do nothing. We're just going to, it sounds right, but the ROI, we don't see the great return on the ROI because it costs X amount and we think we're going to save Y amount. My question then would be, okay, what's the Z amount of the lost opportunity cost? What if I can't get that order out in time? What if instead of getting it out in an hour, it's going to take me an hour and a half? What is the knock-on effect of that? Now all of a sudden my customer is not happy with me. What are the business use cases I can't take advantage of because I'm not taking advantage of some of this technology? That is a part, and I will admit this, those are very hard numbers to come up with. Why? Because it's not a cost. I can't show, hey, if I add this software, I'm going to reduce this much FTE, and there's a very simple math formula right there. Now what I'm asking to do it on ROI model is to say, what is the opportunity cost? What if I can't serve my customer? Or what if I could serve my customer this much faster? Could I charge them more for it? Could I reduce my inventory count? Whatever that may be. And I think from the ROI model, us as software and hardware providers, it's up to us to sort of present that. But I think it's up to the users, the warehouse users, if you will, to think about this. What if I could do X, Y, or Z with more technology because it lets me do certain things I couldn't do otherwise? And how does that impact my ROI?
John, evaluating the ROI, what's your take?
Yeah, well, firstly, I totally agree with Guy that it needs to be revamped a little bit. For those that are using an IRR model, I think would do a little better as far as capturing the lost opportunity costs, because Guy is right. It might feel safe to do nothing, but if there's more available technology out there that can allow flexible deployment, so you can kind of pivot and make changes as you go, that would be a good place to start rather than doing nothing, because then you can amend to that system in a way that's meeting your current business needs. So totally agree with what Guy is saying. And IRR is better because we're going past 5 years more and more. A lot of folks kind of cut it off at that. And I think that there's just too much that is hard to capture. There's these less tangible features outside of that. How hard is it to retain employees in this geography? How long will it take to bring the new hires up to my expected picking rate? How precisely can I deploy that capital when I need to grow to avoid overbuilding? You can capture that year by year in an IRR model a little better than an ROI one. And then I guess the other one that I talk to a little bit with clients is don't get hung up on the picking speed of a picking station. If you have 5 pickers versus 6, it's not going to move the needle on a multi-million-dollar system. The 5X is already there. What you want to spend a little more time understanding in a system is the reactivity, how reliable the system is, how well it can perform as far as uptime, and the way things are actually being done in the system, single points of failure, how do I handle hot picks and cutoffs and things like that. Because that's the landscape that's going to be ahead of you if things are changing. And so I would spend more time analyzing that than I would how efficient I'm actually going to be on a per picker basis. Is more of a holistic view on the system itself is what I would recommend.
Bob, sorry.
No, please.
To John's point, I think I'd like to pull out one of those points he made, which is who knows where your warehouse is going to be in a year, let alone 5 years, let alone 10 years. We know like a 3PL, they might change 6 different types of companies they're fulfilling for, from a toy company to a cosmetics to a pharmaceutical, what have you. And even if you think all you're doing is e-com orders or retail or healthcare, we all know that things are changing so fast. And to John's point, you don't know if all of a sudden you're going to have to, do a 3-hour turnaround instead of a 6-hour, or you're going to have to do more reaches than others. So that's part of it too. And that's so hard to calculate a traditional ROI model. It just says, oh, well, to John's point, I had 6 pickers, now I'm down to 5 and my pick rates go up, 5X. What happens if in, 10 years you're picking something totally different? And that's part of it too, that we really have to force ourselves, both us as solution providers, but the warehouse professionals, to think about that and to have that long-term vision. And again, we all know things are going to change in ways we never thought of.
All the more reason why today's technology cannot lock you into the current state. Definitely has to be ready for those changes you're talking about, Guy. So thanks for that. I think maybe the best way to sell upper management on the need for investment in these systems is to showcase other companies' successes. I'm wondering if you could discuss some examples of companies that have successfully implemented WMS and robotic solutions to optimize their warehouse operations and actually achieve tangible results. John?
Sure. So I'll start with The Gap here in Nashville, in my hometown. They are utilizing our Exotech system actually to sort of amend the existing warehouse automation setup that they have. And it's useful because putting away returns is very inefficient and painful. So if you can use something like a random put away approach, you can actually translate any efficiency gains like that over to robots in a linear fashion. So if you were to add a shuttle aisle, that's a fixed, multi-million-dollar cost, or 3 or 4. You have to kind of stair step the growth in that way. And this is a very close to need organic growth model that you can deploy. And so for returns, it was just a really great and interesting way to handle it. The other would be it's a large general retailer that I can't give the name of, but they have a lot of little stores all over. You probably could guess them. But their store replenishment strategies are quite similar to the e-commerce ordering you would see. They have line level, smaller quantities on the line level, and faster turnaround, so that they can keep inventory at the store and not have it run off the shelf. They want to be able to turn that quickly, so it's very e-commerce like, and they are using our system in a flexible deployment in one of the southern states now, and they are having a lot of success with that. Although it's store, it's still going to be for a growing opportunity for them for, I don't know, the next 10 years at least, before we see something entirely new.
Guy, got an example for me about a successful implementation that can inspire other companies?
No, I'll give you two. One is in the healthcare space, and also can't mention the name, but what's interesting from a successful implementation is this healthcare provider using WMS and a modern version of WMS has been able to start looking at different robotic solutions across the board to implement within their warehouse to tackle different parts, right? So one of them is to do simple each picking, and they're looking at how they evolve with more robotics that they can tie into that system to do other use cases. The other one is interesting. So it's a electrical distributor who has a large ASRS system, unfortunately not Exotech's, but it's really able to use that as a storage facility. But then it's to be able to integrate other robotics and then do other functions such as taking the orders that were picked from that system and then moving them to a loading dock, all being orchestrated or being tied back into the software system that allows everything to, not the whole, well, yes, the whole warehouse, but that specific two use cases to be done in a very harmonious way. And I think what's the lesson for me on that is, it's the ability to show these different examples of companies using automation to tackle specific use cases within the warehouse, obviously tied into a modern software solution, as opposed to just saying, hey, big bang, let's just do everything. Let's just automate the whole warehouse. Because I think that's a pipe dream. But I think those are great examples of how these companies have taken sort of that, crawl, walk, run approach to how they implement automation with their software to address specific use cases within the warehouse.
Okay, so we've covered the State of the Union. We've covered specific tools. I just want to get very briefly into the question of now what? What are the current trends or emerging technologies for these forms of automation that companies ought to be aware of? John?
Yeah, so I think AMRs, you definitely want to keep an eye on those. Just be generally on the look for more of the motions from conveyors being turned over to AMRs. AMRs doing more in the warehouse, increasing in their flexibility. More automated picking, I think, is on the way. We're getting there now. It's getting more accurate and more flexible, but it's going to continue to become more of a mainstay, I would say. And then more and more, we're going to see picking to the shipper, but not just any shipper, but the right size shipper. That's a difficult trick to do on conveyor, and so AMRs have a good solution for that.
Dee?
Yeah, I think we're from the robotics perspective. I think for folks to look to everything just John said about the AMRs, I would push back a little bit on the pickers. I think those they're going to arrive at some point. I don't know if what the time horizon is on that. If I look at a lot of the robotic picking arms, they hold great promise, but then in practicality, it feels like there's still a big chasm that we have to cross. We haven't been there yet. But to John's point, I think especially on the conveyor side, I think to look more and more at what are some of the, what I would consider air quotes here, modern robotics, so AMRs and other type solutions, to basically replace conveyors, right? To your point, Bob, 20 years ago, that was hot. That was the automation we all strive for. Now I think we're realizing there are solutions that can do the same job that are much cleaner, quieter, less intrusive in your warehouse. And in a way, I think it's kind of back to the future where it's, all right, instead of trying to do some really crazy robotic arm picking to a tote, let's just replace a conveyor with some AMR and then we'll proceed from there. So I think we're going to see more of that. I also think what we're going to see is more, more use cases being thought of by robotic players. Like we just saw some at Modex that were humanoid robotics, right? That were literally picking up and moving totes. I think that's really interesting to keep an eye on. Where does that go? I've seen some robotic, we've seen this from Boston Dynamic, some robotic truck offloaders, right? Things of that nature. So I think we're going to see more and more advancements in some of those functions where you've got to manipulate bigger objects in strange places, right? The back of a truck or off of a conveyor line and picking up the tote. But I think, to John's point, I think the big one is going to be, I think, more and more conveyor replacements by modern robotics.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to get into our audience question and questions and answers from our audience. As we are answering the questions that have already come in, I invite the audience to continue to submit your questions, and we'll get to them as many as we possibly can, time permitting. And then I'll just throw these out and see who wants to pick up on them. This question is, what are the guidelines on what the WMS controls and what the robotic supplier controls? For instance, business rules for replenishment. Where should certain rules belong? What is the rule of thumb? Guy, you're nodding. You want to take that first?
Sure. I'm nodding because that is, again, the $10 million question.
Okay.
And I'm gonna use the worst response, but it depends. What I mean by that is what I would say to the person asking the question is there's no hard and fast rule on this. What I mean by that is it really depends on what kind of robotic and automation solution you're looking to employ. And then where does the two, meaning the robotic solution and your WMS, where does that line in the water, where does the water line start and stop? And yes, there's going to be times where the robotic vendor is going to say, no, we'll control that. Maybe your WMS vendor wants to control that. And to me, the advice I would give is that's up to you as the customer to work that out with both solution providers, because there is no hard and fast rule. I will say at the end of the day, the WMS, for the most part, wants to be the system of is the system of record. But if you're going to store items, let's say in an Exotech system, and there's things about reslotting or replenishing, is it really my ability to tell the Exotech what to do, or is Exotech the one that has the best knowledge of how to do that with its node system? That's really something that you have to work out, again, between both providers. And again, I don't think there is a hard, fast rule that says where that should start and stop.
John, you have an idea about where the rules should reside?
Yeah, well, my preference is that Guy would do it. So, and I'm happy to turn that over because what we want to focus on is deploying robotics well. We take the order data and we keep a record of inventory, of course. But we take that and we build orders as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible. And so when it comes to cycle counting and keeping things accurate, we're going to check in with the WMS and keep that as accurate as possible. And so any kind of rules that are needed for counting, we like to amend to the need of the WMS on that and do it as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
This question, I think, is for Guy, and it follows up on what we already were talking about all the various different pieces of software that reside within a warehouse. Guy is talking about integration between software and hardware. The questioner is saying, does WMS provide enough capability to integrate with automation? Here again, what about WES, WCS? Where do you see the line between these two? And for the matter between WMS and WES, which system should manage inventory? You got an hour, Guy?
Yeah, I was going to say this. If we could have the answer in the next 5 minutes, I think we'd be rich. But again, I hate to say it depends. But it's a great question. I think that's what we're seeing in the space, which is, if I go back in the Wayback Machine, I look at WMS, right? WMS, when a warehouse was just basically taking inventory in, stocking it, and then repackaging and sending it out somewhere else. I don't want to say it was simplistic, but it was much simpler than what we see today. So to the question, yes, I think what we're seeing is that WMSs a lot of times were able to handle some of these other functions at a tertiary or basic level. Now, as things have gotten more complicated, we've recognized that actually we need a smarter layer to do control or to do execution or all that. So what I would say is, for the question, push on or look at your WMS vendor to understand what exactly can it handle already. Because sometimes the WCS or WES might be baked in at some level, right? The functionality might already be in the WMS. I think part of it too, Bob, is, and I hate to say this, but it's like a marketing spin, right? Well, we're going to spin off WES, WCS to talk about something else, which is fine because the functionality has to be there. But I would say think about or talk to your WMS vendor first to understand that. Understand what functionality already resides in the WMS. Understand what functionality might reside in another layer. Understand, again, with automation, do you need some kind of integration layer to integrate between the two? What I would say too is the problem is that most WMSs today, are building integrations, but the question becomes 650 different robotics vendors out there. Not all of them have the exact same layer of integration we need. So we're going to need a lot of different specific integration layers to robotics vendors, because until all the robotics vendors get together and say, yeah, we'll build off this one standard, right? This is This is the old beta versus VHS battle, right? If they all say we'll go to VHS, okay, great. Then I can just create one layer to connect to all of it. But that's not the case. So it's messy. There's no clean answer. It's really up to working with your WMS vendor and your robotics player or whomever to understand what the work will take, what the lift will take. Understand that most, if not all, WMS vendors are working in that direction, however.
Yeah. Here's a question specifically for Exotech and about Skypod. What are the main differences between the Skypod system and other robotic systems like Cubebased systems, for example?
Yeah, so I touched on that at the beginning. So a cube-based system refers to a system that is stacking totes on top of each other. And they will build eventually a large cube of those. And those are all serviced by robots that are running on a grid above all of those stacks. So those robots will need to dig in there, and they work collaboratively to do that. What helps them is to have some foresight on that and to be able to work ahead of time and do a shuffling of the inventory. And it can work in folks' favor if they're looking for some cost savings and they have that luxury of the time ahead of the actual outbound waves that they're going to be generating. But we're seeing less and less of that because the e-commerce factor is affecting most companies these days, and they won't be able to accommodate that quite as much. And so the throughput is going to drop pretty precipitously after that. So our system is more similar to a shuttle, where we can get out any tote in 2 minutes or less. And instead of using, a sort of cacophony or chain of machines, whether it's an elevator, conveyor, and then a shuttle inside the rack, we actually use one AMR to go into the system, climb up the racking, retrieve the tote, and bring it back. So you're only deploying the amount of assets that you actually need to do the lift, and not a huge hardware fixture that is going to be a fixed asset that's difficult to move and grow with. So we're as fast as a shuttle, but we're using AMRs like the cube storage folks are. So we're kind of a weird hybrid in the middle there.
Yeah. Guy and John, I want to thank you so much for this fascinating discussion about both hardware and software within the warehouse, WMS and robotics, how they play nice together, how they can be made to play nice together, and the choices that warehouses need to make in order to get into these very valuable investments. Unfortunately, we are just about out of time. I apologize for that, but it is what it is. We have time for just one final question. I'd like both of you to address it. I'm going to start with Guy. What's the automation headline going to be 5 years from now?
One word, and I'm going to try to pronounce it as easily: interoperability. So say that 5 times fast. And Bob, a lot of the questions that we got, I think, address that, right? How will different robotic systems, how will different software systems all work together in a harmonious way to make sure that the warehouse works and meets the needs of its customers? So in 5 years, interoperability will be the key word for robotics in the warehouse and WMS.
What's your headline, John?
I would say that it's going to be robotics are now the leading technology used for intralogistics. So I think that on the trend that we are now, where we are as far as market share, I think we could safely make that bet that will be a headline that you're going to be seeing, because the more and more legacy fixed asset automation systems go by the wayside to the flexible use of AMRs. We're almost guaranteed to be there, in my opinion.
Maybe it can become so familiar, it'll be very much like conveyors, where you don't even think of them as technology. You just consider them, this is the warehouse today. That's great. Thanks again, Guy Courtin and John Jackson, for those great insights. I do want to bring the audience's attention to a couple of assets that I think will be very valuable for you. From Texas, this blog post on why automation is a game changer for your supply chain. That will be provided to you all attendees at this webinar when it's over. And also Skypod is offering Texas is offering a virtual tour of the Skypod system. You can see the future of warehouse automation from the comfort of your own screen. Thanks again, John Jackson and Guy Cortan of Exotech and Texas. Thank you so much, audience, for attending and for your great questions, too. Everybody, have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.